Hey, we're live. Hey everybody. I'm Mandy from Garden, and our aim here is to help people grow life where they live. And today we're going to learn all about growing mushrooms with our first ever introduction to mushroom cultivation with Andrew Coulter, who started his own company, Everybody's Mushrooms, and he'll go through all the steps on how you bring mushrooms from non-existent to harvesting them. Just a quick few things. First thing is just want to thank DJ Petrelli for DJing us into this great mood before the class started. So thank you. Really appreciate it. And also, we're obviously live streaming this, as we mentioned, and we're doing, if you comment at all, you'll be automatically entered to win a $25 gift card to the Garden store. So you can comment right on the YouTube link. But as I mentioned before, feel free to chime in with questions and comments as Andrew is kind of presenting here. So I'm going to get out of the way, and it's all yours, Andrew.
Howdy, folks. I'm Andrew. Hello. So before I get into anything, how many of you have tried or successfully grown mushrooms before? Show of hands. No? Easy. All right. So the real intro. Perfect. All right. So today we're going to go over kind of the depth of a mushroom. So the common misconception of like all fungus are mushrooms. It's more of a squares and rectangles, if you will. Like all mushrooms are fungi, but not all fungi are mushrooms. So it's really just a snippet of the fungal kingdom that produces the fruiting bodies that we're accustomed to eating. So then types of nutritional media, like what things can we cultivate most commercial strains of mushrooms on? Then sterile technique and inoculation. So the biggest thing with mushrooms is clean. So you've probably had bread go bad once in your life, a little bit of mold on there. So that bread was its nutritional media. And because we didn't control what was eating it, whatever's in the great wide world, which is quite a bit, whatever attacks it first will take over. So that's where we want to be keeping things clean and intentional with what we're growing. Then environmental controls. So largely it's mushrooms like it wet, as a general statement. That humidity, since mushrooms are so much large, like about 90% water, is a general statement. Reishi is less. But that's where we need that high humidity so that way they can reach their full potential and not be losing that moisture as they're growing. And then the temperature we grow them at, as well as colonize them, will have different effects. So although you may have a larger flush growing at a higher temperature with blue oysters, if you grew them at a colder temperature, then that slower growth process will give you a denser fruiting body and a more flavorful product that's much more shelf stable. And then harvest and post-processing. Unless you're going into extracting and making tinctures, as a general statement, pull it off, trim off the substrate, and you're good to go. There's been a few studies of like, oh, should I trim the mushroom off while it's still connected to the substrate if you're harvesting outside? It really doesn't make any difference as far as subsequent yields and flushes. Just whatever's easiest for you. So, starting off, mushrooms are the fruiting body of a fungus containing spores that act similarly to seeds and plants. So most mushrooms that we're looking at are in the phylum of Basidia mycoca, so the clubfoot. So that's your lion's mane, blue oysters, wine caps, king trumpets, shiitakes, enoki, all your usual suspects, if you will. That's what we're looking at is Basidia mycoca, and those are two spores joining together, sometimes more. And they will, just like a root, start to grow and with digestive enzymes break up the material around them to expand and colonize. Then the hyphae is the entails. That's the root, the baby roots extending. And its mass is our mycelium. So if you've ever lifted up a log in the woods and you see that little white web growing below it, that was the mycelium. That's its fungal root network, if you will. And then you've also probably heard mycorrhizal fungi. You see it in your organic soil. It says mycorrhizal fungi. So that's really just the certain fungi, mushrooms that interact with plants, whether that be on the outside of them or inside their root system. And different terms, so I won't go into it. So, jump into different types of mushrooms. Our saprophytic, our primary decomposers, the general statement. These are the ones that we're largely growing as they're the easiest to cultivate. You give them material, they break it down, and then they throw a fruiting body to try and reproduce. The endless cycle of life. Then we go into mycorrhizal fungi. So these are, though technically able to be cultivated, are much more difficult and selective in which ones have been successfully cultivated, such as morels, which, although they can be cultivated, have been cultivated, there's a lot of debate over the flavor of the artificially cultivated ones. And in a general statement, if you ever see any videos of Chinese morel cultivation, it's really just shade cloths on the side of a mountain that they just sprayed morel, like mycelium, all over it in an environment it would already grow, and then just added some amendments. They're just intentionally forcing a hillside. So it's a weird approach, but it does work. So mycorrhizal, because that symbiotic relationship with plants, that's why they become much more challenging to cultivate. Then we have parasitic. So, anyone heard of cordyceps? So, parasitic fungi, depending on what kind. Largely, they attack insects. There's different strains of cordyceps that attack different ones, do different things. But what I have on the screen is a lobster mushroom. You'll actually find them around here. Not this time of year. So what the lobster mushroom does is it actually attacks Russula mushrooms. It's a family of mushrooms. Then it will grow this big, bright red, dense fruiting body that smells like seafood. I'd call it more like crab than lobster personally, as far as the odor, but it's, no, you peel that thing up, throw in a little, what is a crab cake? The kids will never know. So, commonly cultivated species. So, we've all heard shiitakes, I assume. See them in your grocery store. Then oysters, there's so many different kinds of oysters. Those are Pleurotus. So I won't even go into all those. There's like a dozen different kinds. Lion's mane, probably heard that. It's a big part of the conversation these days. Different forms of lion's mane, bear tooth, lion's, won't go into it. But these are all here the saprophytic, and that's why they're the primary decomposers. These are easiest to kind of artificially cultivate. So going into types of nutritional media, with plants, how we're largely focusing on our NPK ratios. So for mushroom cultivation, we're largely focusing on our carbon-nitrogen ratio. So really all we're doing is supplying building blocks for this mycelium to convert. Because the fruiting body is the same cells that you're seeing in the ground, just stacked in a different form. And just like your cells, the spores are your DNA, your sperm and eggs, just breaking it down into diploid and haploid cells. And then our other like macronutrients, potassium, phosphorus, magnesium, is important depending on what strains you're trying to cultivate, what genetic line of that strain you're trying to cultivate, all these little nuances, as well as our trace elements that can inspire pins to form in a more rapid setting. So, to focus on the types of nutrition for a little bit longer, you can access carbon and nitrogen in many different forms. The most common that people are using for today's like commercial cultivation is what's called master's mix. It's a 50-50 mix of sawdust in the Northeast, most commonly red oak sawdust, because we have a lot of it. And the lumber industry, well, they produce a lot of sawdust. If you're near Maine, you can buy that stuff for cheap. And then soy hulls, soybeans, the hull of the bean is then milled up and mixed. And then if you buy it from a supplier, which I recommend because it's real easy, they will pelletize that for you, so that way it's perfectly mixed, and you just add your hydration into one of these little bags. And then, because think of this as an artificial log. So what my bags are is just cocoa coir, millet, gypsum, and hydrated lime. Oh, and vermiculite, sorry. The vermiculite really just holds water because it's better for your initial flush to have that large water source. And then the cocoa is just contributing to my carbon mass. And then I have millet in there, which is my grain spawn. I'll go into that once we get into inoculation. So that's all this is just a nutrient load in a block. Because the mushrooms, just like it were in a tree, will colonize this block. And then once it's fully colonized, it will say, oh no, I'm trapped. At which point you cut a little opening like a mark in the bark of the tree, and then it says, oh, I can breathe. And then you get it misting, and it's like, wow, what a beautiful fall evening. I love this. I'm going to venture out into the world and try and reproduce. It's true, it's true. Their motivations are very simple. So, for our inoculation, the way we start with mushrooms is a piece of the genetic. So you can get that by, if you go to your local grocery store and you find a little white button mushroom and you say, I want to grow these. Well, if you have a nice little lab set up at your house. Or actually, if I can pull this out. A still air box. So you also don't necessarily need one of these. You could go to Home Depot, buy the nice furnace filter, that 20-inch by 20-inch furnace filter, the one that says viruses and germs. Slap that onto the back of a hopefully new box fan. Let that run in your closet while you're sitting in there for like 10 minutes. Turn it off. That air is shockingly clean in there. You can get away with quite a lot just by scrubbing your air with a furnace filter. So at that point, you take your little white button mushroom, and you'd have, pardon me, I brought these as an example of how casual you really can be and still attain success. So Petri dishes are time consuming and not the cheapest option in the world. So these, you ever had Jello shots?
Mhm.
So these cost about $3.50 at Walmart. If you wipe the outside of the package and pour your agar solution into these, I'm doing this in front of in a lab setting. I typically get about 1 out of 50 will fail off the bat, which to me is pretty easy to not have to individually wrap Petri dishes because it's really time consuming. And after like that 4th hour listening to like the hum of a fan, you just want to get out. So yeah, all I have in here is malt extract. I don't know if you've ever made bagels before or if you've tried to brew your own beer. Probably encountered malt extract. So I use these plates were low nutrition. Sorry, I'll start rambling about like nutritional. Sure, I'll get a little too technical. So it's just malt extract, agar, set up in a firm set. So that way you take your little white button mushroom, tear it open, take a little clean biopsy with a sterilized scalpel or an X-Acto knife if you don't want to spend the extra dollar to say you own a scalpel. The X-Acto knife will work just as well. You get that hot with a torch and you just take a little biopsy of the inside of your mushroom. Throw that down onto your little plate and you'll see the mycelium grow out from your biopsy. The mushroom will grow, and that's a clone. So that's one thing we'll do in cultivation when we see like, oh, just like this one really, really did well. It just like outdid all of its brothers and sisters. So we would then take a biopsy of the inside of that mushroom and clone it. So we will have just like cloning cannabis, a very related line. So when we do spore starts, it's just like popping seeds. You have an idea of what you're gonna get, but the actual end result is a lot more of a shotgun of like, it hasn't proven itself. So
How do you collect the spores?
So spores, as a general statement, when you harvest your mushroom, you'll see the gills on the underside of the cap. So as long as your mushroom is freshly harvested and it was old enough to be throwing spores, just take your cap, leave it on. I like a piece of tin foil because it's easier to collect afterwards, and a bowl on top. Some people say you should put water on top of the cap. I find they always throw spores. The water on the top of the cap will simulate a rain event in theory, so that way it's like, oh, well, now it's happening, it's raining, and it will spread and shake it. But as long as you keep it in that humid environment, you'll see the next day spore prints. And the different colors spores can be, gee whiz. Like you can get like vibrant pink spores, like dark blue, pitch black, like luminescent white. Yeah. And that's also for foraging, a common identification tool. So you're like, well, I'm pretty darn sure it's this, but I don't know. But I also can see that it's in the identification guide, its spore print is a rust-colored brown. So then in the woods, I just have like a piece of paper, like Post-it cards, throw that in your little foraging bag, and in about like 10, 15 minutes, look at it again, maybe half an hour. It'll probably have thrown spores. Really, I'm like, they just throw spores. They just want to do it. Though I will, kind of a tangent, certain commercially cultivated lines, is the spore load that they're producing is so heavy that you don't even want to go through the trouble of trying to filter the exhaust of your mushroom grow back into your space. Just because the amount of spores they're throwing off, it's just bad for your lungs. You don't want to be breathing a bunch of dust. So it's often in commercial settings just vent that right outside. Don't even bother trying to filter it. It will destroy whatever filter you try. So they have, through gene manipulation, cultivated mostly oysters that don't produce any spores. So like all we're stuck with is clones, but also it's really nice in a commercial setting where okay, now my workers don't have to worry about during harvest like 4 years of exposure of huffing spores if they were refusing to wear a mask for some reason. Yeah, so and Enigma doesn't throw spores because it's a mutation that has grown so far away from its original self that you can't get spore from it anymore. And then some of them, like some mushrooms that will no longer like throw spore, but if you swab their gills, you could still collect. These are more like heavily commercialized lines that if you're starting from nature would never happen. But so once you have your mushroom biopsy and it's grown out on your plate, you can then take that, and if you want to be held to academic standards, you do 8 transfers. This will probably take about 2 months of your life and focusing every week on having to meet a deadline. But if you don't care about academic standards, if you just do like 2 transfers and you're not seeing like bacterial or other growth around it, you're probably going to be just fine. And you can then expand that to liquid culture. So all a Petri dish is a 2-dimensional plane of nutrition. So this allows us to clearly see what growth is occurring on our nutrition. Liquid culture, like a mason jar with gas exchange that you could put this little specimen you've now started growing. These are blue oysters, by the way. You can throw that into your liquid culture jar, and now we're growing in a 3-dimensional plane as mycelium wants to grow out radially. So now we'll just see these little orbs growing up, and we can shake this. Ideally, we have a stir bar and a stir plate, and we can really blitz that jar up so that way it will tear the mycelium. It just helps it colonize faster. It's the same thing. The mushroom you see growing out, the mycelium on the ground, it's just growing out, eating nutrition. What nutrition you're feeding it, you'd be amazed at what you can use. Certain things are more advantageous if you're trying to get selective isolated growth and train it.
So when you're like eating like lion mane has all these like great benefits, right?
Yeah.
Does it have to be cooked to have the benefit, or are people just eating it raw in order to get the benefits?
Actually, most of the alkaloids that we're looking in lion's mane are rapidly degraded in high temperatures.
Okay, so like if you do want to get some great benefits from all these mushrooms, it's best to just like eat them raw.
I would say extracts. The only reason why is when eating them raw, mushrooms produce one of the large components of their cells is chitin, which is the same material that insects make their shells out of. So we don't have the protein chitinase in our digestive tract that helps us break that down. So depending on how sensitive your tummy is, if you're eating these raw, also some mushrooms have certain things present. So as a general statement, I'm always like, please cook them. But lion's mane you can eat raw and get away with it. You're gonna be fine. But if you have a sensitive tummy, you might feel a little indigestion. But generally, an extract is the best. Though I wouldn't really recommend extracting it yourself because also you're probably going to be using ethanol, and unless you have a setup and know what you're doing, I just say please don't play with highly flammable liquids. I'm not saying it can't be done, but I'm saying don't burn yourself. Alcohol burns really, really hot. It's gonna be a bad time if it goes bad. And because you need to be pulling that in your reflux. Well, not reflux, in your rotovap. You're going to want to be pulling that under vacuum. So if you're pulling it under vacuum, in order to keep your condenser cold enough, you're gonna need a really nice chiller. What size operation are you trying to run? I'm like, at that point, you probably already have like over $15,000 worth of equipment to like bottom tier production. That's where I'm like, but I'd really recommend for lion's mane doing like an ethanol water extraction, but to get the full range of benefits,
Yeah.
and you're probably gonna be better off buying that.
Like the mushrooms version of making Vigo.
Yeah, there's it. I'm like, cause it or like
Cost to extract it though, right?
What?
Alcohol and water, because alcohol will extract everything from it, correct?
that's why I say I do the dual.
Correct.
But like alcohol will like ethanol will get the vast majority of it for lion's mane, and then like what mushrooms are you extracting? I'm always on the side of like just do a dual extract, so that way hard to miss if you swing with a tennis racket. Yeah. Yeah. So, when I was, we can see here, agar, media, and liquid culture, the time it takes to sterilize is at 121 degrees Celsius, that's 250 degrees Fahrenheit, at 15 psi. In a pressure cooker, I'd recommend an autoclave, it's just a fancy pressure cooker that the pamphlets will tell you not to cook food in it, but I know I could make pulled pork just as well. So a pressure cooker you've probably used has a weight on the top of it that is regulating the pressure it can achieve in this vessel. So an autoclave is a sealed vessel that has a heating element inside and will allow itself to regulate that temperature and stay in the correct range for your selected time. It's going to be more expensive, but you won't have to listen to a pressure cooker go for hours on end. So for agar, media, and liquid culture, you really only need, in an autoclave, I'd say 15 minutes, you're fine. If you're using a pressure cooker, I always recommend 25 because I don't trust those weights. I don't believe them. I think if you're not using a calibrated gauge, it's probably a lie. I just don't trust those weights. And then grain spawn, most common thing people are doing at home. That's kind of a challenge. If you're doing that in jars on your own, I would sterilize for an hour and a half to 2 hours at 15 psi. Let's get an hour and a half if you're using an autoclave, 2 hours if you're using a pressure cooker. The issue when using a pressure cooker though is you can run dry. Depending on what kind of pressure cooker you're using, if you run dry, that's a catastrophic event. If you're using an all-American pressure cooker, those are expensive. And so if you have your $400 or $500 pressure cooker and it runs dry and it's solid cast aluminum, and then you warp that and now it never holds seal again, and they say, well, yeah, you avoided your warranty there, bud. It's gonna be sad. So I say an autoclave, it's gonna cost more. It's a sealed vessel. I'd be amazed if you got it to run dry. It's a worthwhile investment if you want to do this seriously. And then green spawn in bags, I do 2.5 to 3 hours, same thing. 3 hours in a pressure cooker, though be very wary. It's easy to run dry in those pressure cookers. Or 2.5 in your autoclaves. So the most common thing that the individual will be dealing with is pasteurization. So we don't really need to make our own spawn, if we will. Like if you want to grow at home, you can just buy a bag of colonized spawn and eliminate yourself so much headache. Like the petri dishes, the liquid culture, and grain spawn are going to be your biggest hurdle as a hobbyist. if you're willing to spend $2,000 on your hobby, you're gonna have a lot more success, but also a big learning curve. So if you're willing to just buy the spawn elsewhere, like buy your lion's mane spawn, your blue oyster spawn, it'll be much, much easier on you. So then if we have now our master's mix, our sawdust and soy hulls, we can take that and different methods of pasteurizing it. What I would say is the most economical and easy for small scale is scorching. So you find, depending on how much you're trying to do at once, you have the right amount of water. As a general statement, you're trying to achieve between 60 and 62% hydration for your mix. You just have that much water already pre-portioned out, and you boil it. Now in a 5-gallon bucket, my personal favorite are the ones from Market Basket because they're food safe and $6. If you have a Moe's sub near you, they will sell you their old pickle buckets for $1. They're like super heavy duty, airtight, fantastic. So you'd have your master's mix in there, you take your boiling water and dump that in and throw the lid on. If you're doing multiple, just stack them. If you're only doing one, throw a blanket over it. You're trying to keep that between 145 and 165, leaning on the 165 degrees Fahrenheit, for at least 2 hours. This will achieve pasteurization. So then if you are scaling up a little bit, say now you have a 55-gallon drum with a propane heater underneath it and a water line in with a float valve, so that way it can run all day long. And you just have this big veggie steamer, if you will. You could then have your bags filled with your master's mix, or turkey bags, or whatever heat-resistant container you so choose. And you steam those veggies. And you can achieve that pasteurization as long as you can reach your internal temperature of 165 for 2 hours. Though if you're running a steamer and you can do this, I would recommend doing ultra pasteurization. You can. Not so much if you're trying to grow portobellos, but I'm like, why are you trying to grow portobellos? I was like, Pennsylvania already figured it out. They sell them for $2 a pound. They're so expensive to grow. Don't even try. But if you can achieve like 200 to 210 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 hours, that will be ultra pasteurization. For a lot of the hobbyist growers, the headaches will disappear quite a bit. You will have way less trichoderma. You will have way less bacterial growth. It will be a much nicer time. Or if you're doing more, I would recommend for outdoor grows. I don't think chemical pasteurization is the most economical for indoor. It's just kind of a mess in some ways. So either you can use quicklime, but only certain kinds. I'd recommend just sticking with hydrated lime. You're trying to make sure it doesn't have a high magnesium content. Most like gardener's lime, you'll see, that's hydrated lime. But it's commonly sourced from dolomite, which is a rock in the US, and it has high magnesium content, which is great if you're growing cannabis, awesome. But mushrooms, that magnesium level will actually diminish it. It will slow the rate of growth and diminish your yield. So we don't want the gardener's lime. The real one you want, you go to your local Agway. You say, get me the bag of hydrated lime, the 50-pound bag. I know this sounds excessive. It's going to cost you $20 and it will last you far too long. And there you go. Or if you have a lot of hardwood ash, you need more of it. But hardwood ash is largely calcium oxide or quicklime. The gardener's lime, but not a dolomite source because it's calcium oxide. hydrated lime is calcium hydroxide. So when you add the water to it, the hydrogen bonds to and through exothermic reaction. I want to go too in depth and just ramble. Like it's not necessary.
Dude.
But so that's right, hardwood ash. We're looking for the calcium oxide to increase your pH above 11 is your real goal. pH strips will work for this. If you grow pot, you probably have a blue lab sensor.
Cameras.
It's gotta be great. So that's where, if you're trying to, if you want to add mushrooms to your garden, you could just have a tote, throw a bunch of wood chips in there, and get that pH up to 11, and that will chemically pasteurize them. You leave it there for like 12, 24 hours. I just come back the next day, dump that out. You take your blue oyster spawn that you purchased, and you break that up and mix that into your wood chips. I will say, if you're like spawn, if you buy grain spawn for your project, the little critters love it. So the squirrels might steal quite a lot of your spawn. Honestly, what you're gonna have more success with is if you buy just a grow kit for whatever mushroom you're trying to grow. You get your little harvest off of it, and then just break that up and mix that into your now pasteurized wood chips in your garden, and they'll colonize. Yeah. So if you're trying to do like outdoor log cultivation too, you can buy like sawdust spawn, but when you see sawdust spawn, they're really just trying to charge you more for a grow kit that hasn't fruited yet. So like just buy the grow kit, and then get your little plug injector and into your logs. And the logs, I would recommend chemically pasteurizing them. It's just easier to do those. They're big, they're heavy, they're kind of messy. I do it outside. And going into environmental controls. So I was talking about different temperatures. So for your Petri dishes, as a general statement, incubation temperatures are considered like 80 to 85. This changes for certain species depending on what isolations you're trying to grow. But most of the mushrooms that we're trying to grow, like our oysters, our lion's mane, our shiitakes, we're going to be trying to keep our temperatures between 55 and 60 for our fruiting period. And we can keep that same temperature for our incubation as well when colonizing our blocks. This will just allow it to create a higher quality mushroom that encourage slow growth, just less water, more mushroom, if you will, and will give you better shelf life. That humidity, so you've seen like Martha tents, perhaps? So does anyone have a humidifier in their room during this dry winter?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you have that running nonstop in a small environment, you can get that humidity up to like 85 pretty easily. So for small scale in a little tent, those humidifiers will work just fine. On a larger scale, those humidifiers, they're commonly running through ultrasonic, so it's creating a pretty good fog. But if we were to look at the true particle size of that, the microns is actually like kind of large. A lot of them will be around like 5 microns. And that particle size is not fine enough to evenly disperse into the air and raise the RH in a rapid and effective way. So for commercial settings, what we're largely doing is pressurized air humidification. So having a water line and a pressure vessel, your little air compressor running to it. And I like the Hart Environmental Systems. They've been used in Pennsylvania for a long time. So what they do, and just like really great for cannabis and veg, like fantastic. It creates what's called a dry fog. So the particle size is down to 0.2 microns. So you can have your hand like 4 inches away from this nozzle, just blowing fog. Leave it there for 10 seconds, look at it. I mean, there's a little bit of a sheen, but your hand will never drip. You won't get water all over the floor. You don't have these little puddles building up, letting bacteria grow and nasties. It's a nicer time. It's a real nice time. Light, as a general statement, is not required at all for mushroom growth. It's largely just used for the direction and mass triggering. So like shiitakes are, once they're ready to fruit, are very, very sensitive. So like if you bump into a rack with a bunch of shiitake blocks on it, they're gonna start fruiting, and you wanted them to start fruiting in like 5 days because you were trying to schedule markets. And you're like, oh geez, what am I gonna do? Or like, oh, you didn't mean to turn the overhead light, but that big bright light you have, it will shock the whole room into fruiting. So it can, in high light intensity, can be used to instigate fruit. Though then some mushrooms like enokis, if you ever go out and eat ramen, you ever seen those like thin white mushrooms that they put in the corner of the bowl? So enokis in the wild look absolutely nothing like that. They look like a normal, like your stereotypical brown cap mushroom, stem about the size of your finger, growing out of a tree. Normal. But the way those are cultivated commercially is with very low airflow, so there's a much higher CO2 level in the room than they'd ever encounter in the wild. Because your average CO2 outside is around 400 parts per million. So they'd be cultivated in a room at around 1100. So good for cannabis, bad for mushrooms. They're just sitting in their CO2 production. No one wants to sit in their own CO2 production. So because of that, they don't grow out very wide. They just send these tiny little shoots. And they're also grown in very high temperatures, which allow them to then stretch even further and just be these tiny little water sticks. Yeah. And also in very, very low light. So because of that, the caps don't really develop because they don't think that they're above ground yet. They're just pushing vertically. So then they just have these tiny little like bottles, really. They're just yeah, a little shot of enoki. Yeah. Though I will say, enokis, because they're grown in that high humidity, high temperature, low lights, like no UV, they are very susceptible to listeria outbreaks. So cook them, please cook them. Don't eat them raw. If you see raw enokis on your ramen, please ask them to cook them and say, please don't do that anymore. I don't want anyone getting sick. Just cook them. That's like, oh, like, can we eat things raw? I'm like, where'd you get it? Do you know what their handling practices are? So if you're growing your own lion's mane on like a wood block, like, yeah, you're probably gonna be just fine. But if you're buying it from the grocery store, also as a general statement, lion's mane doesn't have an exceptionally long shelf life. You can extend this quite a bit if you're willing to keep your mushrooms at around like 34 to 35 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, mycelium does not want to colonize further. If you've ever bought mushrooms at the grocery store and you pull them out, and you're like, oh, is this mold on the bottom of it? No, mushroom's probably just trying to eat the box. Really though, I'm like, you can bring like a 5-pound like box to market, and then you just like pull one of the mushrooms off, and you're like, it's growing in the box. All because it was summertime and it was like, oh, it's warm, so they're like, I'm gonna eat it. Yeah. So CO2, especially like if you're in a little Martha tent, the easiest little number is try and see your parts per million for CO2. Definitely get a CO2 monitor. They're very cheap. It's like $10, and it will answer a lot of questions for you. If you're like, none of this makes any sense. My mushrooms aren't fruiting. It's just sitting here. And even when they do fruit, they're like kind of stretched, but also not going anywhere. And I'm like, what do I do with this? I'm going to guess your CO2 is too high. So CO2 monitor, keep it below 700 parts per million. It will eliminate a lot of problems. For harvest and post-process, as I was saying, it's just easier to pluck them and trim the substrate. The amount of effort it takes to try and cut a mushroom off the substrate and not damage it, it's such a headache. If you want to do it, go for it. I don't have the time for it. I really don't. And there's been enough studies that you're not negatively affecting subsequent later flushes. The worst thing you're doing is possibly disrupting the surface mycelium. So if you're trying to fruit directly in that direction, you might have a slight delay on how long while the mycelium heals itself. You know, if you got beat up in your own home too, you'd be like, I don't want to move for a week. So that's where but you can also just turn your block, or when you're harvesting blue oysters, if you're doing the peas, we would have this all bagged up and we have a little cut in here. That's where it would grow out. And then once that was fruited on that side and I had ripped it, honestly, I'd throw a piece of tape on it, I'd cut the other side, and in about a week it would throw again. Yeah. So then I have, well, it's not going to let me go all the way down. But if you want sources, I will say I didn't properly cite everything in text. I do have everything APA citations, but I did not do my in text. I'm really sorry. I'm lazy about it. It's not commercial. But yeah, it's kind of I can replace a bag. You want to do I can do a demonstration of how to.
We don't know what we're doing, so we're just putting lots of cameras out. Hopefully something's good.
Yeah, you want to, so I have a question. How do you know when it's time to cut the bag?
So that really depends on the species. So if you were trying to cultivate reishi,
It's like 6 months.
yeah, literally, I was gonna be like, in 6 months.
Yeah.
Blue oysters, it depends on your spawn rate to your bags for it to fully colonize. Basically, you're waiting for it to go through initial colonization where you'll see your mycelium wrapped around your entire media, and then it will go through what is called secondary colonization. Basically, you see that colonization thicken. You're like, oh, that looks a little bit more pronounced, and at that point, it's tough because mushrooms, it's the same thing like plants of,
Right.
well, when do you know your spinach is ready?
Right.
When do you know your tomatoes? And I'm like,
Yeah.
well, they're different.
Yeah.
Like they're both plants,
So
but
you do it more, you kind of know about the days to harvest, and then really you do it off of how it's looking.
yes.
Okay.
And
you want it to look
especially
it's
with
thick and-
when to harvest
Yeah.
is so dependent on the species, it's dependent on your temperatures, it depends on your goals. You know, when is the perfect time to harvest? Well, if you have someone that wants to buy a pound of blue oysters and all you have is one block in front of you with mushrooms on it and it looks like a pound, now is the perfect time to harvest it.
Right. But so basically, in that bag, it would be when it's full of white is when you can
Yes.
start. You make one X at a time.
Yes.
And then let it a
So,
each way, or
with this colonized with blue oyster, once this is fully colonized, there will be some gas inside, largely just CO2. So what I would do is I'd clip the top of it, so that way I can expel all of the gas out.
okay.
And then at that point, I would I put a rubber band around it just so that way I don't get any real gas exchange. Normally, like you don't have to, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it as it feels real fiddly for the first like 10 or 20 bags you do. But you can also just wrap the bag into itself like a little burrito, and then you don't have to use rubber bands.
Yeah. You
That's
cut the whole top off,
no, just a little clip so that way I
Oh,
can
I see.
expel the
Got it.
gas.
and then you just
Um,
block that little clip off, however you want to do it, burrito style or
Yeah.
otherwise.
So in a lot of like commercial cultivation settings, so that humidity that we're adding with our hard environmental system, our dry fog. So I also inline, you can use like bleach or peroxide in very, very low levels, so it's not dangerous to consume at all. I like peroxide because the smell of bleach haunts me. Any little bit of it, I'm like, "Ugh." So I stick with peroxide. Also, I just feel better about it. But,
Yeah.
it's very common. That's what you use inline, so that way your whole fruiting room will stay clean, rather than you going in. Like you could also, if you had like a fruiting room and you did not have inline like peroxide, you can also just mist with if you have a fogger, awesome, or you can just mist your room each day. Don't spray directly on the mushrooms, but if you were like spraying your walls, spraying your floors with peroxide, it will
They can both go in
significantly
there.
it will significantly reduce your rate of contamination. So everything's about just reducing your rate of contamination as far as like sterile procedure, and it's tough. Like in a hobbyist sense, you're just trying your best. Like, are you gonna experience contamination? Probably. I'm like, you can do it perfectly, and you're still gonna be experiencing like a 1% rate of contamination, and that's like you are in a complete lab. Like everything's perfect. It's like, well, guess the world's not perfect, Sonny.
What is the contamination? Like, what do you like? What's the result of it?
So, well, contamination, just like, what color did your bread turn? Did it turn gray? Did it turn green? Did it turn kind of a greenish blue?
Like, will it be edible, or is it like destroying the whole mushroom at that point?
That it depends on the contamination. Like, if it were Neurospora, I'd be like, bad. Like that wrecked terrible times in Paris in the mid 1800s. But if it was Trichoderma, as long as you're not eating it, like just cut it off, you're fine, and don't be in the room with it for long without a mask, because long-term exposure to Trichoderma spores has been linked to lung cancer. And then like a lot of the largest thing you're gonna see is bacterial blotch. So it's just bacteria. So cut it off, and mostly it'll be like right at the very bottom, and that's most often caused by your humidification system not being repeatedly cleaned. So if you're using your humidifier in your Martha tent, you're going to want to clean that out with vinegar on a regular basis, because I don't know if you've ever run it for a week and then wiped your finger on the corner of it, but you might question what you're breathing. And because of that fog, that bacterial growth happening is now just getting spread everywhere. And because we have these nutritional blocks, that's where we start running into these issues of, we have a nutrient mass. Things want it. That's why we're trying to stay clean and control what microbial life is colonizing it, until the point where we now put it into our fruiting room. Though some species like reishi, you can actually you can fruit in the bag. It's like a 6-month period and then another like 3-month fruiting period. So it's really I have this thing that sits on my mantle and eventually I'll have a harvest. But that's how a lot of commercial reishi is cultivated. because if you've ever seen it growing outside, that nice bright red fan growing out of often hemlocks. So that big fan only occurs because of the high air exchange. If we kept that in a high CO2 environment, we only get the stalk, which are called reishi antlers. If you want to buy it wholesale, reishi antlers. So that is them just growing straight up in that high CO2 environment, never fanning out. Just like the enokis kept in that higher CO2 environment, never fanning out, just staying nice and thin. So depending on what CO2 levels we have, we're going to end up with different expressions. But as a general statement, we're always trying to go closest to nature for the most efficient product. So I'll cycle back on the different nutritional types. So depending on what you're using as your base nutrition, you'll have different rates of biological efficiency. So that's the way we measure kind of commercial viability and profitability in mushrooms. So your biological efficiency is the wet weight of your harvest compared to the dry weight of your starting substrate. So if we say I had 1,000 grams of starting substrate in this bag that I then hydrated. So my first harvest off of this, say I got an 800 gram wet harvest off of that 1,000 gram dry originally. I would count that as an 80% biological efficiency on that product. So depending on what our nutritional media, we can see different rates of biological efficiency. With a lot of oysters commercially, we're trying to hit at least 100% biological efficiency. Though if you're willing to go like multiple flushes and do like small scale stuff that commercial growers never would. I've seen people achieve like over like 250% biological efficiency. They're flushing the same block repeatedly and taking on a level of risk and decrease in yield that a commercial farm never would. But you still can, off of a singular block, achieve incredible return.
Dumb question. On the flush, what do you mean by like multiple flushes?
So when I say flush, that first growth of mushrooms off your bag is called a flush. So that is the first push that they're making in completing their conversion.
So how many flushes could you get out of one bag?
Infinite?
Is that right?
Well,
Many holes.
it's
Contamination.
until it contaminates. And it's if you step halfway between here and the wall, when will you ever reach the wall? Never.
Gotcha.
It's as long like you just have lower and lower and lower and lower and lower returns
Like
until
it wouldn't like the substrate doesn't run out, like it doesn't have a time.
it does. It gets smaller and smaller, and it's
because it's being consumed.
literally you are pulling out the carbon and nitrogen with each harvest.
So it's either until it runs out of nutrients or until it gets out-competed by a contaminant.
Yep.
I had a follow-up question on the contamination, because obviously, as you said, some contamination could be more serious than others. But essentially, and tell me if this is true or not, a contamination would just out-compete the mushroom from growing. So it's not like you would have a contaminated mushroom, you just wouldn't have a mushroom to harvest. Is that right? Am I thinking about that right?
Yes to both. You can end up with a contaminated mushroom.
Okay.
Largely, it'll be bacterial contaminations on your
right,
mushroom.
right, it was bacterial, and that's more of like the humidifier.
Yep.
Okay.
Where you'll have issues. And then when you have contamination on your block, that's where it will be outcompeting your mycelium for the available
Right,
nutrients.
so you just will never have anything to harvest.
Yep.
Right.
And sometimes the mushroom will still go to fruit, but it will be significantly reduced as part of its energy is currently going to fighting off an outside combatant.
could you, like, let's say you have something that looks like mold
Yeah.
next to a mushroom that's grown, could you eat that mushroom or just call it?
I would say as a general statement, if it looks clean, it should be clean. And if you wash it off, if it's just the risk of spores on there,
Oh, right,
and then I'm also like, what kind of contaminant?
right.
'Cause there-
No, that's a good
that's
point.
where I'm like-
It could look like it's, but there's
Yeah,
spores on it.
that's where
yeah.
I'm like, or the subtle difference between like lipstick mold and neurospora,
Right.
where like they both look kind of pink,
Okay, so
though
maybe
slightly
call.
different. Yeah, that's where I'm like, so it depends, but like when in doubt, throw it out. Is your health worth part of your dinner?
So on a bag, sorry that I'm like, correct, anybody else, please feel free to jump in, I just am like loving this. On a bag like that, once you cut it to get the first flush out, the first harvest, it's obviously no longer a sealed, sterilized environment.
Yes.
So when you flush it again, do you have to worry about that, or are things you're supposed to do, or you're
You-
not supposed to reflush a bag?
So you're having an increased rate of contamination. This is largely caused because as the mycelium ages, it is excreting, as all living things do. And this acidifies the block. This acidification will stress the mycelium, allowing it to have an increased rate of contamination. If you're sitting in piss and poo, you might get sick too.
Yeah,
So that's where it's more like you can, but secondary flushes always carry an increased risk. If you're maintaining like sterile conditions, when you're harvesting, you're doing it clean, you're staying clean. Well, if you're not introducing anything from the outside, then there's nothing to compete with it. That's one of the things I do with these bags. So the most common contamination a lot of people encounter is trichoderma or green mold, which has definitely eaten a couple loaves of bread of mine in my life. So trichoderma cannot grow in an environment of 9 pH or greater, but mycelium will grow uninhibited. So I will say, I'm like, portobellos can be like a little picky on their pH level for optimal yield, but they'll still grow. So mycelium will grow in an environment uninhibited until about 9.5. So I keep my substrate at 9.1, 9.2. So you should definitely get a first harvest. I've seen people run these bags in some really dirty spaces, like squirrels in the walls. It's like the leaking roof with the mold in the closet. I'm like, you shouldn't live here. And they're like, yeah. In that setting, I was seeing about 3 out of 10 fail before they got to a first harvest.
it's because the pH is set so that the trichoderma mold can't take
Yeah,
over.
which is
and
your most
So
common.
the mushroom should be the thing that causes.
And if you are having issues with contamination in your own setting, I'd really, really recommend just like spraying down your walls and floors with peroxide at honestly like at 2% you're fine, like 3% is good, but like 2% you're fine. If you do that, think of it, to me, I was in cannabis for a long time, so I always cycle back to, you have an active pest outbreak, you're going to be spraying every other day until that problem has resolved. And then at that point, I feel like every third day, because I'm scared and I don't believe it, and I'm just lying and I haven't seen it yet. They're there. And then once I get down to maintenance, now I'm doing it once, twice a week. But also, if you can get inline peroxide, oh my goodness, you don't even have to care. You're just gonna be clean. Yeah. So that's where these bags I keep low nutrition. This is more of a focus of getting you to success. This is not what I would call a commercially advantageous design. Like if you were trying to sell the market, I'd be like, no, talk to me. That's a different product. This is, you are a hobbyist. You want to take a syringe of Blue Oyster, Lion's Mane, or whatever you so choose. You want to wipe the bag down in 70% isopropyl alcohol and stab into there. If you don't have a brand new sterile syringe, the needle part of it.
Do you wanna show us how to do it? I'll get you
Yeah,
alcohol.
Yeah.
Or-
Do you have gloves? I don't need
Yeah.
them. I don't need them, but
So like all your bags are pre-pasteurized, or like ready to
fully
go?
sterilized.
Yes, you just take
Slam
them
it.
culture, slam them, ready
Yep.
to go.
I'll let you kind of.
And I'm like, there's, if you were trying to do that at like scale, you know, if you were trying to run 2 of them, it's like, yeah, just take a syringe, stick it in. If you're trying to run like 100 of them, there's different ways that you can streamline that process. At that point, also, I'm like, you're at scale, you should have a flow in.
And you do all of them the same way, like how you flip the bag, you just kind of cut it open and just let it grow to the side?
I mean, it really depends on what you're trying to grow.
Okay.
That's like so many. I'm like, it's species dependent, but as a general state, like saprophytic, the primary decomposers, whenever you throw them, as long as it's nutritionally like advantageous, like they will grow freely. So you will have your mushroom body.
Are you working right there? If this is the Zoom,
Sure.
just want to get some good shots.
Will this work? 99.
Oh, no, I need 70.
Oh, you need 70.
Yeah, I need 70.
Okay.
Yeah. So another.
More
Oh,
was
sorry.
better.
Because they need water.
All
Yeah.
things, every step of your process in sterile tech. Yeah, that's where I'm like, sterile technique is going to like 40 minutes of.
Yeah, why can't you use 90?
So just like bleach,
Oh.
pure bleach is not going to kill things as well as diluted bleach. So the way it's dispersed, I'm not great at articulating this. I'm much better with diagrams. Like, so yeah, I'm like, I want to paint it. I want to draw a picture.
It's so
Actually, right
concentrated,
there, there's
essentially.
a,
It's
like a
too
direct
much.
shot, yeah.
So I need water to diffuse it, so
Yeah.
that way the contact is more efficient and more effective.
Do you want me to make
So-
30% RO water?
Yeah.
Cool.
Little this, a little of
How
that.
precise does it need to be?
Decently.
Okay. I'll measure.
Um,
I'm gonna use a pitcher and that water.
I'm like basically as long as I'm below 75 and above 65, I'll be fine. Yeah, 70% ISO.
so for the, if you were growing like mushrooms in your garden for the chemical pasteurization,
Yeah.
the 11 over pH, the pH 11 plus,
Yes.
so you said the mushrooms grow best 9.5, so would you have to actually pasteurize it until the pH is 6?
Though, honestly, I'm like, if you mix it, it will, that pH will drop on its own over the next like 48 hours.
And it's not in the environment, so
Yeah, that's where I'm like, outdoor cultivation is such a trying your best. And because like you're not held to the restrictions of a commercial business. That's if you will achieve surprising success with that. If you want to utilize it more rapidly, like if you were trying to run it in a commercial setting, I would recommend doing a rinse with distilled water. But if you're doing this outside, really, I'm like, you're gonna be fine. So I will say, like, try not to get up to like, don't get your pH too high, because if you start getting up to like 13, which also, yeah. But also, I'm like, if you're at 13, like your skin's gonna burn,
What's the
dude.
lowest-
Like,
What's the lowest pH a mushroom can grow at? Just like, cause like when we buy like soil sometimes,
yeah.
like,
Well,
when
I'm
you buy
like,
like a super soil sometimes, like if you can get lucky and have like a mushroom grow out, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, obviously we're growing cannabis, so our pH in our soil is not above, 6%.
The ideal pH for portobellos is actually 5.5 to 6.
Okay.
Yeah,
that
they
makes
will-
sense.
But then comes into the question so much as what like the pH of your soil versus just it's more salts available and therefore your soil tends to be more acidic. Not being said that you couldn't drive it to like a more basic pH and
Yeah.
still have these nutrients available in the mushrooms
It's
to
just
utilize them.
mushrooms taking out the nutrients enough to make the pH for itself get
Well,
higher.
that's it because they're not as restricted for nutrient mobility in accordance to pH as cannabis is, because they are reaching into every single nook and cranny and through digestive enzymes breaking down their surrounding environment to forms that they can use. And that's where like a lot of their breakdown for nitrogen ends up in like the form of ammonia, which plants can use, and that's where we start looking at mycorrhizal relationships. Thank you. Some labs / literature will really get on you about and a torch. You have dab torch.
A torch?
Yeah.
A torch
Dabs?
Yeah.
That'll do.
That was good cheese lighter.
Love it. So,
Do you want to? So you also cleaned your gloves? Is that what you
Oh,
just
yeah.
did?
Everything gets wiped in ISO. Ideally, so I haven't taken my bag out of the box yet. I wipe down my work surface. I take my bag out of my box. I wipe every little nook and cranny of my bag. I then take my syringe of Blue Oyster mycelium. We'll say I should have let this jar colonize for about 5 more days, but I had class today, so.
You're saying you let the syringe colonize 5 more days?
Honestly, I would if I could.
You got the message, I have one that I ordered, right?
Yeah.
Is that what?
Well, that's just because you can get the mycelium to further colonize within a syringe. So it will colonize until it utilizes all of the available oxygen that is dissolved into your liquid. And then it just kind of stalls out.
So is that also like an eyeball thing? Like you can see how much is floating in there?
Oh yeah. I'll pass these around.
But I'm saying,
So-
so you know, like when it's kind of like milkier, that you like that better kind of thing?
Well, not so much milky as I can see a denser concentration of mycelial mass. So all I'm doing here is I'm heating up my syringe to the point of red hot. When you see red hot metal, everything's dead. So you just take your syringe, you wait for it to cool about 10 seconds. And send that home. I wipe right before I stab in. That's so that way my patch is exposed to the outside contaminants for as short of a period as it possibly could. Because while I drive that syringe in, if there was the possibility of an external mold spore right at the surface where I drive that in, I'm introducing contamination. So that's why in the open air setting, it's more of a focus of do it small, do it quiet. If I were to do this process inside of a still air box, so you can also make a still air box, but I'm
We're straight for powderized products.
I'm so big on the, like, if you have a little closet, just get a 20 by 20, like, get a box fan, slap the furnace filter on there, and hang out on your phone in your closet, and a little stool for 10 minutes while that blows around, and then shut it off and do your work. And as long as you complete your work within the next, like, 15 minutes, you'll be amazed. Wear a mask. I have a mask.
Andrew, I know some
It's-
people like shake it up. Are you a proponent of that or not a proponent of that?
So when sending liquid culture as a general statement, yes, but I say shake it up if you're sending liquid culture to just grain spawn. I say this because grain does not absorb moisture as rapidly. Because I'm running an all-in-one bag, my spawn, as we were talking, like grain spawn, fully colonized, nutrient-dense media that mushrooms do not want to fruit on because they're like, this is far too rich for my taste. I don't belong here. And then we expand that to our bulk substrate, a lower nutritional media that will be rapidly colonized by our mycelium that already has this nice bank of energy. So that's what this is. I have my spawn and my substrate together, right? Yes. So I have my spawn and my substrate together. And because of that, the cocoa will absorb water far more rapidly than the grain ever would. So for this, I'm not as concerned about shake it up. With grain spawn, I really advise shaking it up just because dispersing that moisture prevents it from really collecting at the very bottom. And if it collects at the very bottom, that high localized amount of moisture will create an environment that is really nice for bacteria, and at which point you will have a higher rate of commonly sour rot that plagues the wine industry. That's what hurts a lot of your wine grapes is sour rot. Yeah, if ever you're like, my bag, it has this weird jus on the bottom of it, and I smell the filter patch, and it smells like apple cider vinegar. You don't want to throw that out. But with these all-in-one bags, the cocoa just absorbs it so rapidly. That's like you can see it doesn't settle to the bottom. I will also say my bags, I have them designed to send a full 10 milliliters, like a full syringe. Some products will say like, oh, only use like 2.5 or 5 milliliters. So I have my moisture like just a hair low. So that way I'm anticipating that full 10 milliliters of moisture going into it. So that way I'm hitting the right hydration. This is also something to consider if you're doing like bulk cultures and spawn of your own, is adjusting your humidity and your moisture content so that way you can anticipate throwing liquid culture to it. If you choose on throwing liquid culture to it, you can also throw plates to this. If you were in a clean setting, you could, and you didn't have a syringe, you could just cut the top off, throw your plate in, seal it back up. I just have this because I assume most people don't have the fun toys that keep you sterile and in a lab.
Great assumptions.
Yeah. Do you want to put that in a window, in a dark closet, in your hydrogen peroxide Tupperware container? Where does that live?
Although certain species will colonize faster if kept in relative darkness for the first week, it's more about like how fast you want it to colonize. As long as you're not in direct sunlight, you're probably going to be just fine.
So don't put it in a window.
Don't put it in the window, yeah, because
But
Is that what that shoebox technique people talk about? They put it in the shoebox? Is that what that technique is?
well, to me, like a shoebox, this is your shoebox.
Oh, okay, that's what they mean by that.
This is, well, because it's just a closed vessel with a bit of headspace. So here's your shoebox.
That's your sterile shoebox.
Yep, it's
Yeah.
already done, put together. Shoebox.
Throw it in the closet.
Throw it in the closet. Throw it on your mantle.
So
Put it on your kitchen table as
so
a conversation
that
piece.
itself doesn't need to be in a sterile environment. It should be all sealed and it can just live somewhere not in direct sunlight.
Yep.
And then when you cut it open, then do you want to move it somewhere sterile, or you also should be all set?
As a general statement, since it's now fully colonized, it has its big boy pants on.
Yeah.
So it can hold up to a fight. Not perfect every time, but it is much more tough and rugged than it is in
It will
this.
beat out the
Yeah.
things that are trying to outcompete it for food.
Yeah, everything is controlled, and although some unlucky point might get beaten up and lose ground, as a general statement, it's pretty tough. It doesn't want to lose whatever nutrition it
And you
has.
didn't take the side, right? You just stuck it, put it in there, and then.
You can tape the side. Some people. So taping the side is more something where people running their own bags, buying an injection port and putting that on themselves. If you were doing that, I would really recommend taping it. That's more because I don't trust the adhesive of those the injection ports. I'm using unicorn bags. I'm a little sad that they went to foam, but I haven't seen any issues arise with it. I miss their old silicone injection ports. And you can see that it has a extra layer keeping it secure. So because of that, I don't really worry about taping it personally. But if you were not using the injection port unicorn bags and it was still exposed, I would definitely tape it. But more me not trusting the adhesive.
So kind of if you go the bag route, other
Yeah.
than like the first time of wiping it with an alcohol pad or the 70% solution, and obviously having your hands clean and the
Yep.
syringe clean, after that you really don't have to worry. Just let that bad boy run.
Yep.
And then just cut it open when it's fully tons of white in there.
There
Well,
literally
that seems a lot easier than some of the other ways.
there's the filter patch on here. Only certain viruses can get through there.
Yeah,
So you're gonna be just fine.
yeah.
If it does fail, I'll be like, what happened?
Yeah.
No,
So I'll just
they're
say about
specifically not
your-
supposed to do that.
about your everybody's mushroom bags. Matt and I had looked at other bags previously, and just sitting on the shelves, they would start to colonize, which meant they were contaminated. And so Matt did an experiment where he put them in water and submerged them, and we could see air bubbles coming out, which by definition
Well,
means
hold them
they're
off the shelf, because every time I
Yeah.
bumped into them and they would start contaminating. And then
Yeah.
I realized it's the seams on the bottom after. I was like, you know what? I'll keep it for myself.
yeah.
They can't-
So what
I
we
was like,
loved
but
it-
I realized when I was pressure cooking that seals were totally ripped at the bottom. And we've heard from a lot of people. You ask about contamination, they're like, oh, just send the bags back. It's like, do you understand the headache that is, and the cost?
Yeah. And then people are failing when they're using them and they think they did something wrong, but it's because the product wasn't sealed. So what's great about these is you obviously go to great lengths to make sure that's a sterile product, and then
I have
because you do the pH style, that's also less likely for contamination as well. So.
Yeah, I have a 4-foot by 12-foot autoclave that goes directly into a positive pressure lab with a wall of laminar flow hoods. But pressure cookers work too. Like
That is why that's there. Yeah.
you don't need a cast iron vessel that you and your friends could fit inside of. But yeah, so that's why these bags are my consumer product is focused on you achieving success in your own path, like whatever you're choosing. There's so many different kinds of mushrooms to grow. Really, it's tough. It's like, what are you gonna plant in your vegetable garden this year? Well, I got some ideas, but
And you're eventually going to be offering the syringes, but are you currently?
No, my genetics partner, her child got a little sick, and then
that's
school vacation. Yeah, you know.
No, it's okay. But you're
Kiddos,
you're eventually going to have it. So you
Yes.
can do the whole package.
Yep.
Got it. Yeah. But right now you can just order syringes online.
Yeah. And if you like, shoot me an email. I was like, I got stickers. I got stickers. If you want, shoot me an email if you're ever looking for cultures, questions, concerns, comments, anything.
You got them available today?
Yeah,
Yeah, actually, I got Blue Oyster syringes here.
Take a kid and
Yeah, where are they?
Yeah.
We have stickers, those have the website on them.
I was
so
like, the syringes are free, but the kits are theirs technically.
Yeah, I'll take it.
Yeah, I
Oh, yeah, the
think.
box
Right.
is actually
What's the
good.
price on the kits? Was it 19 something? Am I remembering that right?
You do what?
Oh, let's pull them up.
Yeah.
You want to?
I will tell you, there's been a bag that he brought us.
So I will say with the
You added that.
with the syringes, since I didn't normally I don't run syringes as a business. Like I can, it's more just like for my personal like genetics expansion.
Yeah.
The only thing I would say is don't suck back as you'd be
Yep,
introducing
right
it here.
Yeah.
It's only push down.
Okay.
So you're doing today. You're doing a free syringe with a
Free-
mushroom bag
Well,
or whatever. Just
yeah,
a free
well, I'm
syringe.
like free syringe. Anyone want a Blue Oyster
Yeah, okay,
syringe
cool.
or a Blue Oyster
Very
plate?
kind of you.
Of course.
Would there be a difference starting with this in the bag?
Well, so this
I
to
think
get
he said
into that, you
5
need
days
to
would
cut
be
open
his
the bag.
favorite.
So unless you are working
Yeah.
in, like either have a still air box or a laminar flow hood, I'm like I'd say just do the syringe. Because it's
out in the loop.
your easiest path to success. It's all closed. While this, at some point, you need open air transfer, and that.
Exposure rate goes way up. And these could use 5 more days, right? So if we take these,
I would
wait like 5 more days for it to fully. What are these
Yeah.
called?
Huh? What are each color? Absolutely.
I did take
yeah.
2. Sorry, I took 2.
No, you're good. No, please. Thank you.
Awesome.
Yeah.
When you do the transfers, you have to do it in a sterile environment, like in something like that. When you're
So-
transferring these back and forth.
So basically, imagine I did not have a mycelium growing on this, and I just had blank plates.
Okay.
I could have this in a petri dish. I just brought these as an example.
I see. So
For-
we're not
'cause it-
fully-
Well, and honestly, I'm like, I really only use petri dishes for pictures. I've
good format.
I've spent way too many hours in front of a hood because petri dishes. I don't know if you.
Not super familiar.
So
I mean,
it's
I know
literally
they
just
are.
a plastic cup and then a plastic lid.
Right.
There's nothing snapping that together. There's no
saying
contact.
Okay.
So you have to use parafilm
Mm,
um,
and do
to
the
wrap around them.
yeah.
So each and every single one of them you have to wrap.
Yeah.
Or you could take these things
Brilliant.
and just go dunk,
Yeah, I love
dunk,
that. That
And-
event I did too.
and me literally just wiping the outside of the package
Mhm.
from Walmart because it's the cheapest one. I get 1 out of 50 fail off the bat, and then
Yeah.
like after a month, like another one. So I'll end up with like 48 out of the
So-
50 in the package,
Yeah.
and I don't have to wrap it. I don't have to do anything.
Mhm.
It holds the genetic just as well. And
If the teacher just has any failure rate, it's worthwhile.
I'm just like, yeah, I'm
Right
like, I
away.
just don't want to wrap it.
Yeah,
I'm like, I
Skip it.
literally, I have them for like photos and being taken seriously.
Yeah,
Because
right.
I'm like, can I
exactly.
do it? Yes. Can I have
Of
this guy?
course.
Yes, I know.
Right, I see what you're saying.
But also, it's so much labor.
Yeah.
And when I'm looking at like how much of my day was spent wrapping
Right.
plates,
It's
and
not
then what do I consider my hourly? And I'm like,
Yeah.
I spent how much
Time
in the last
consumption.
month
Yeah.
wrapping fucking plates?
Get only a batch.
Yeah, literally, I'm like,
What a big deal. That's
all
good.
right, I'm putting in the jelly shots.
Yeah, it's such a smart idea. That is
Yeah.
I like that idea too.
So, yeah, it's
So that's
just
mycelium, as we're saying,
yeah.
growing right on top. That's so sick.
So you have a hospital-sized autoclave, like a big. sterilization machine?
Well, it's a retort system.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So good.
So like
Definitely try it.
Yeah.
technically an autoclave, but a retort.
Yeah, right.
It's not.
I'm embarrassed.
No, though I'm like, I still got the sliding racks.
Oh
you know
yeah,
what
that's
I mean?
amazing, right? That's so good.
A
Yeah.
walk-in autoclave.
Yeah, it's so cool.
Scary.
Well, I'm like not
Yeah,
full
super
walk.
scary. You see the door like it's something.
Yeah, I know.
Don't
that's
go
scary.
in.
Yeah, the ones where you have to like drill, like cut out the concrete and add in reinforced concrete because it can't support the weight and heat normally.
Oh, crazy. So
Not
cool.
no, I was like no one of those. Those are the full walk-ins. I wish
Yeah, it'd be awesome.
because to get a new walk-in autoclave, you're looking at like 200 to 400.
Wow.
Got like 4
Wow.
at work, and they're like
Wow.
scary. You're like, there's a lot of protection so you can't click yourself. But
Yeah. Really.
Well, it's no one's talking about the fact that it's a fucking bomb.
Is it
like-
really because of the pressure?
the wall, the door is like,
Yeah, it's so thick, right?
it's so reinforced.
It's
yeah.
It
It's
is.
how expensive they are, but I guess if
Well, it's
it's like a bomb.
You don't want it to explode.
yeah. It's like I'm not buying the cheap
Yeah,
one.
right,
I'm like,
Yeah, you don't want to.
it's funny. Like literally,
Save 20% on my.
like you can buy like a 2,000 liter retort like autoclave
Mm-hmm.
from India
Oh, cool. I like that.
for about $4,000.
Yeah, awesome.
If you were to buy the same system in the U.S.,
Distributor direct.
where someone will actually answer your phone call if you have a problem,
Mhm.
and you're like, I
It's
think
making
I'm.
a weird sound.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
dude, I'd much rather talk to Frank, honestly.
Yeah.
Like in those moments where I'm like, but
Yeah.
in the U.S. you're going to be looking at like 20 on the very low end, like 20 to $40,000. And I'm like, like the 20s are not quite as like 20,000 is not quite as expensive one. And then you can start getting into like vacuum assisted, water cooled autoclave, you know, so that way you can have a more rapid turnaround time. Like, yeah, that's where I'm like, we can,
Like
pressure vessels and stuff.
small one for like one bag that you can fit in there is
Does the
probably
trick.
like $1,000.
Yeah.
Well, honestly,
That.
Thank you so much. Sorry.
of course.
It's okay.
What I really think is it's tough because it's still like a relatively high price point for any hobbyist.
Yeah.
But I head over heels recommend for a small producer the All American 41.5 quart autoclaves. You can commonly find them throughout the year on sale for around $1,100, but are commonly at around $1,300 to $1,400. But if you're willing to cut a few corners,
This is hobby
you
mushroom,
can-
right? That's the point.
you can really fill those things, and you can sterilize about like 56 to 60 pounds.